Hello, and welcome to your online grant writing modules. Our first module is creating grant application components. These are the types of application attachments and the types of information that you'll likely need in almost all of your grant applications. So we're going to help you get started with those before we dig into any customized writing. As we get started in this module, I want to take a moment to introduce myself. I'll be your trainer throughout your grant writing modules. I'm Diane Leonard, a grant professional certified through the Grant Professional Certification Institute, and also an approved trainer of the Grant Professionals Association. I'm here to help you. And so at the end of each of our modules, you will find my contact information so that you can reach out and ask questions that you may have had over the content in this section. In this first module, we'll be covering the data that you'll be using to help your grant makers, your grant reviewers understand your community and target audience. You need to remember that your grant makers, even if they are from your own community or region, might not have the deep knowledge and expertise that you and your organization do. So we need to be very selective in thinking about the information that we will present so that our reviewers and our grant makers have a new, deeper, dangerously knowledgeable understanding about our community and those you're proposing to serve. As you think about the data that you might be using to help your grant makers and those grant reviewers better understand your community, oftentimes your nonprofit, your grant-seeking organization will rely on some form of needs assessment in order to gather data that you're going to present in the grant application. So on the screen, I have 5 very common needs assessment processes and tools that nonprofits and grant-seeking organizations rely on when they're gathering data, thinking about what are the programs, what are the services that we will be offering. The first is data analysis. So analyzing data that you as an organization already collect, already have the rights and access to. The second is interviews and observation. So you or your colleagues, your staff, talking with those that you serve, having some one-on-one conversations or observing those clients, those community members interacting with your programs and services. The third is about focus groups. So bringing together a group of potential clients or stakeholders, or bringing together a current group of patients or customers, stakeholders that your organization works with, so that you can ask questions of the group. The fourth is personas. So thinking about our stakeholders, our clients, our target audience members, and generalizing them into representative users or groups, thinking about the motivators, the behaviors, the barriers, the gaps that they might be facing as they encounter your organization and your programs and services. And then the fifth are use cases. Thinking about who might use our service in the future, why might they utilize it, where, why, and how. So those 5 needs assessment processes and tools can be helpful for us in writing our application when we're gathering the data that we will use. Now, you do not need to have all 5 needs assessment processes complete in order to write an application. Far from it. In fact, what I'd encourage you to do is to think about 1 or 2 of the needs assessment processes and tools that are already being utilized in your organization and think about how they complement each other. How is it that the information from one process might interact with another? How does it help you build out your overall story? So for example, if you have data analysis as one of your go-to needs assessment processes, maybe then the way that you balance that is with focus groups. There's no right or wrong combination, but I want to highlight that you do not need to have all 5 of these processes and tools being conducted in your organization, shared in your grant application in order to be competitive. In fact, that is not the case at all. That's actually probably too much information. So with whatever combination of needs assessment processes and tools you utilize, you need to be thinking about how it is that you'll be citing the data that you gather, the data that you assess and compare to national data or maybe county-wide or regional or statewide data, you'll be looking at two types of information. There will be primary source information, so data that is created at the time of study. A big national example that many organizations rely on is Census Bureau data. And then that also leaves us with our second type of data, secondary source information. So information that's created after the fact. So maybe a local newspaper article that is providing their spin on what the information is after the fact. You will need likely both types of information within your grant applications over the period of a year. And what you want to remember is that regardless of which data source you're using, whether it's internal needs assessment data or a very large national primary source like the Census Bureau, you need to be very careful to cite that information within your application, whether it is an in-text citation or whether it is a footnoted citation. You need to make sure that you answer for your grant maker, for your grant reviewer, the big question, according to whom? And how old is this data? You do not want your grant maker, your grant reviewer having unanswered questions, because when they scratch their head, especially for questions like according to whom, they are likely to be less likely to advocate. It is likely that your competitiveness has just dropped. As you're thinking about what type of data should I be collecting, there's so much information. How do I know what is best for all grant makers, for all grant reviewers? The answer is truly that it depends. Each grant maker, each grant reviewer has a slightly different professional path that has brought them to this point in being a reviewer. In fact, actually, it's not just a slightly different path, it might be a wildly different path, but they are passionate and knowledgeable about the subject they are reviewing for. Well, why do we have these dot-to-dot pictures on the screen? Why are we thinking about these butterflies? The reason is to show that all three of these dot-to-dot images, they outline a butterfly. But depending on your reviewer, depending on their life experiences, their professional background, their knowledge of your community, they might see the butterfly best in maybe image 2 versus image 3. Or maybe it's actually image 3 over image 1. Or yet another reviewer, it's image 1 versus 2 or 3. We just don't know because our reviewers are so diverse in their backgrounds. So we need to provide our best data to ensure that as many reviewers from a variety of backgrounds can understand our complex community, the complex individuals and communities that we work to serve. Our goal is to create as clear of a picture as possible for as many reviewers as possible. Now, one way to think about that, instead of the dot-to-dot images where we could see all three butterflies, although with varying levels of detail, is to think instead about taking a road trip and what it might feel like if while you're on a road trip, all of a sudden your mapping program tells you to take a sharp left or take your next right when it's not what you were expecting. That could feel similar to an experience of a grant maker or a grant reviewer when they are reading through a needs section and they are starting to gather a story, starting to piece pieces together based on the data that you're providing, based on the citations that are available, when all of a sudden there's an extraneous piece of data that they're left trying to figure out. Wait a second, how does this connect to this or to that? It can be as jarring as that mapping program quickly telling you to turn left or right, and they're trying to figure out, how do I come back onto the path? The problem, unlike a mapping program, which will ensure that your car continues to get directions until you end up back on the path, when you're thinking about a grant application and a reviewer, there's no one there guiding them in quite the same way. So to prevent them from potentially getting off track and maybe getting distracted and coming back into the document in a slightly different place than we would have liked, we are best to ensure that we only provide data that is relevant to our story, to not provide any extraneous information or data points. What are the best data points to include? Well, we want to make sure that our grant makers, even if they live in or are aware of our community, our region, our state, we want them to best understand the hurdles or the barriers that our current target audience, those that we anticipate serving, what is it that they are experiencing? What is the data that will help give context to those hurdles, to those barriers? We cannot assume our reviewers' experiences are exactly the same as those that we will be serving. Far from it. We should never assume any knowledge. So what is the data that best helps to present the hurdles and barriers for the grant maker? We could also think about it from the perspective of what gaps might be missing. What might be issues that have not yet been addressed in the community? How do we know that they're missing? How do we know that this is an issue that needs to be addressed within the community? It'll be up to you to select your best statistics in order to determine what's the best way to describe your community and your target audience to your grant makers, to your reviewers. As you think about the data that you're selecting, please remember that you need to give context. Local compared to regional, compared to state, compared to federal. But that none of your needs statements, none of the data that you choose will be exactly the same story or exactly the same path as your colleague or your organization that you work with and collaborate with one county over or just down the street. So if you have questions about the needs statement, about the data you'll be gathering to paint the picture of your target audience, of your community, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can reach out after this module with any questions that you have by reaching me at Diane@dhleonardconsulting.com. I look forward to seeing you in your next module.